basic principle of Anglo-American law is what's loosely called presumption of innocence. It goes back to 1215, when the barons extracted from the king, King John, Magna Carta, part of which is the Charter of Liberties, which stated that no free man can be accused without a speedy trial before his peers, otherwise he's innocent. That enters into the American Constitution in Articles 5 and 6. And over the centuries, the concept was expanded. So it went beyond free men, which meant free men, to people, ultimately with the 14th Amendment to former slaves. Still has limits, but which it shouldn't have, so it doesn't include aliens. For illegal immigrants should, but anyway, it's been expanded. In recent years, we're seeing a contraction. The concept of presumption of innocence is being contracted. Now, of course, it's not the first time. History is not steady progress. There have been periods of regression, and we're now in a period of pretty sharp regression, in which the concept of presumption of innocence has been virtually abandoned. The NDA is one case, but one of a great many. So it takes a drone warfare. If you look at the detailed descriptions of how the president determines who's going to be murdered, the Scott Chain article in the New York Times gave a detailed account, presumably leaks from the White House. It's the way they want it to be seen. Effectively, it gives the president the authority to kill whoever he feels like on suspicion that maybe someday they'll harm us. And the suspicion can be a group of men standing somewhere, and what are they doing there? Actually, the criticism came up, and the Justice Department, Eric Holder's Justice Department, responded that they are, in fact, getting due process as required by our law, because the executive has considered the matter internally. King John would have laughed with hysterical amusement. That's where we are. And that's one case. There was, again, in the case of drone killings, there was a bit of a controversy, not much, over the fact that they killed an American citizen, actually two, and then his son. But if you look at the New York Times headline when he was killed, it captured the general mood. Something like West celebrates death of anti-American cleric, or some phrase like that. So we just celebrate when we carry out the kind of murder of a suspect without trial, without due process, if he's anti-American. Maybe government claims he did something else, maybe he didn't, maybe he did, but that's what trials are supposed to be for. And this holds even for people who are, you might have claimed in this case, I think, illegitimately, that they hadn't apprehended him. But it also holds for people who were apprehended. The most striking recent case is Osama bin Laden. He was captured. Question the legitimacy of the capture, but put that aside. He was captured, apprehended, defenseless, no arms, under the supervision of Navy SEALs. One possibility was to bring him to the United States and have a trial. The other possibility was to murder him and throw his body into the sea. Well, we know it was done, and we know the reaction. Applause. Presumption of innocence. Well, what happened to that? He was a suspect. Doesn't matter. I mean, you and I may think he's, not even a question about whether he's guilty, but we're not the ones who determine that. In fact, if you look at the evidence, it's not all that overwhelming, but that's irrelevant. Since 9/11, there has been a steady erosion of fundamental civil liberties. having to do with illegal government wiretapping, now illegal no longer, even if it is by law, killing people who the executive doesn't like, detention without trial, indefinite detention. That's the NDAA case. In fact, in my view, one of the most serious attacks on civil liberties has barely been discussed. It was a case initiated by the Obama administration. It's called the Holder v. Humanitarian Law Project, if you want to look it up. The Humanitarian Law Project is a legal assistance group which was charged with giving legal advice to an organization that the government has placed on its terrorist list, which incidentally is an arbitrary list which has no justification whatsoever. And if you look at its history, it's pretty appalling. So, for example, Nelson Mandela was on the terrorist list until about 4 years ago, because the Reagan administration described him as one of the more notorious terrorists in the world. Saddam Hussein was taken off the terrorist list in 1982, so the Reagan administration was free to provide him with assistance and arms and so on. And the whole idea of a state-determined list of terrorists with no recourse and just what they think is pretty appalling in itself. Anyhow, they gave legal advice to a group on the terrorist list, and according to the Obama administration, that was material assistance to the group. Now, material assistance to terrorism had a standard meaning. It meant you're a terrorist, I hand you a gun. That's material assistance. The Obama administration expanded it to legal advice. In fact, if you look at the wording of the court judgment, it pretty much extends to contact. So, for example, I happen to have met Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah. They could interpret that as material assistance to terrorism if they liked. That's a case brought by the Obama administration. They won at the Supreme Court level. It was argued for the administration by Elena Kagan, Obama's latest Supreme Court nominee. That passed virtually without comment, but I think that's quite an astonishing attack on freedom of speech. And there are many other examples. What's happened? Well, you know, since 9/11, the bars are down. And it's not a big surprise. Actually, the first, I started having interviews about 9/11 literally while the buildings were still smoldering hours later. And my first interviews, when I was asked what I thought the consequences would be, I said, well, it seems obvious. Every power system in the world is going to exploit it to expand their own power, authority, repression, and violence. It's an excuse to do it, which is pretty much what happened. You look around the world, it's exploited by almost everyone. And in the United States, it's been exploited this way, to Patriot Act, eavesdropping, huge databases of citizens' activities, which can be used for who knows what. Examples like this, assassination at the whim of the executive, and so on. That's serious. And it's happened before in American history, in worse cases. So Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare after World War I was much more extreme than this. Destroyed the labor movement, crushed independent thought, deported thousands of people the government didn't like, political activists. The COINTELPRO operations that were initiated actually by the late Eisenhower administration, but they really took force in the 1960s under Kennedy and Johnson, continued into the Nixon administration. These began with, these are actions by the National Political Police, the FBI, to try to undermine political dissent. It started targeting the Communist Party, then Puerto Rican independence movement, Native American movements, finally the entire New Left, the women's movement, Black Panthers, Black nationalists were a particular target. And it was no joke. It reached as far as literal Gestapo-style political assassination, the staged assassination of Fred Hampton, a black organizer in Chicago, was finally ended by court order under the Nixon administration, at least formally ended. We think it was ended, and a lot of material came out on court order and congressional inquiry, and so you really look through what happened, it's pretty horrendous. That's right through the most liberal administrations and into Nixon. There was a very strong reaction to Nixon's crimes after Watergate, but just to talk about my personal reaction, I was asked right away to New York Review to write about Watergate, and I said I would, though I didn't think Watergate was very significant. The Watergate exposures came out at the same time as the COINTELPRO exposures, and the latter are far more significant than Nixon's peccadillos. And no doubt he was a crook, and he did things that were criminal, but the worst crimes of his administration actually were taken out of the indictment, the bombing of Cambodia, for example. And what was left was things that he shouldn't have done and were, in fact, violations of law, but nowhere close to COINTELPRO. But just take a look at the reaction. Watergate, enormous reaction, huge impact. COINTELPRO, barely discussed, disappeared, forgotten, which is not unusual, unfortunately, and is a sign of the lack of concern for fundamental civil liberties when defenseless people are attacked, marginalized defenseless people. You do to them pretty much what you like. And now it was revived again, the same tendencies after 9/11, using the opportunities offered by a massive terrorist attack. I think we should be struggling against that, and we should recognize that the erosion of fundamental rights is going very far, and so far that we're actually regressing to the period before the 13th century, where the central foundations of Anglo-American law were laid in weak form then, strengthened over time, improved, now regressing. That's not insignificant in my opinion.